Well, hi, Peter. Good for us to be together to chat about these chapters again. And I know we both continue to enjoy greatly our conversations with all the folks that have jumped into this with us.
That has been remarkable. Folks have brought their own perspectives and experience and their own questions. Some of the formulations that we've heard of ways to think about what Halik has been talking about, but really what we experience in life that which Halik just points us, has been really fantastic. So,
Yeah.
to be back together again. Although I have to say, Hayden, I'm kind of glad that you're taking the lead on this particular set of 3 chapters, because partway through it, I just wrote across the top of 2 pages, what's he talking about?
Yes, it was your turn to ask that question, Peter. And I have to say that as we've talked a little bit, we both felt like he just meandered a little bit more in these chapters, and there were moments when they looped and went unexpected places. So I think it would be helpful for us actually to start at the end of our selections for this time, and just hear this last paragraph of the chapter, because I think it's really helpful. This is on 142. Let us not expect from faith and teachers of faith perfect explanations for all the disturbing mysteries of nature and history. They offer us something far more important, the strength to confront honorably and without fear all these phenomena and the whole of unadorned reality. So to break that down a little bit, Peter, when I read that, I was immediately brought back to where we just ended at the end of chapter 8, where Halik contrasts loving ourselves with loving the truth. And what that in the end kind of comes down to is loving what is real, or what we actually experience, and living with it rather than setting it aside or running away from it. In fact, trying to get closer to it. And so as I thought about that and saw that this was where Halik finished, and as we chatted, it occurred to both of us, I think, that there's a way in which in these 3 chapters, Halik doesn't actually want to explain in a final way these topics, but instead wants us to think about what it means to love reality, the reality we're living in, with respect to 3 things. In chapter 9, it's others. In chapter 10, it's enemies. And in chapter 11, it's evil and tragedy, or what we might just call the world. And so if we get at these 3 chapters from that angle, by seeing what it means to bear with others, to bear with enemies, and to bear with the world, I think we'll get close to where Halik was aiming and wanting us to go, even if it's not where we always felt him leading us.
I think that approach does a lot to help organize what to me seemed like an almost random wandering through a variety of topics that didn't always obviously connect with where Halik has been. But as you talk about the bearing these things and loving reality, you take me back to one of his foundational points, which is that God is neither object nor subject, but the, what was his word, the biosphere of life. And more recently in chapter 8, we talked about, and he talks about the idea that truth is not a proposition which wraps up reality so that you can put it on the shelf under the right label. But truth is the way in which we live. and the way in which we live in response to an awareness that we live in God, in this biosphere, which suggests that as he takes up these 3 chapters, and honestly, until you framed it this way, I didn't have quite this clear and neat a picture, but it really is, I think, what he's talking about others with tolerance. He's talking about enemies very explicitly, and he's talking about evil and tragedy, the world as we experience it. And as he moves through those, he's not looking for the doctrine or the formula or the encapsulated articulation of an answer. He has some insights, he has some touch points that seem to him to be valuable and consistent. He has an approach that carries him forward day to day to day. But whenever he wrote this, that was that day. And he was leaving open the possibility that in this amazing reality in which we live, on another day, it might actually be different for him.
I think that's right, Peter. And as much as we might really like him to wrap it up in a bow and give us something that we can put on our shelf, he just kind of refuses to do that in a way that I hope ultimately helps us. So
well, your quote from 142, let us not expect from faith and teachers of faith. Don't look at me, he's saying.
That's right. Oh my goodness. Yes.
Even though I'm writing the book.
Yeah, even though it may look like I just tried to explain these things, that's not what I was doing.
That's not what I'm doing. Exactly.
He gives himself the perfect out, but more charitably, he's on target with how to get at these things. So, in the chapter on tolerance, Halik goes some interesting places. One of them is talking about the history of this idea of tolerance and pointing out that different people have sort of shown how it's grows out of a Christian imagination or framework toward the world, and maybe even had a broader and deeper sense when it was first meant in the midst of a time when Europe was sort of torn apart by what you could call a lack of tolerance, and particularly religious tolerance.
They were called the wars of religion, right?
Exactly. And so in a sense, Halik wants us to say first that tolerance had its place and may still give us a nice starting point. But he's adamant that it's not the last word. And instead, he wants us to think more deeply about how we engage with others, and specifically in interfaith dialogue, Peter, it seems.
I think part of his very keen insight about this is the way in which the world has just gotten smaller, and we all know that. And that's so commonplace at this point to observe that we're living much more closely with people who are much more different from us than would have been the case 1 or 2 or certainly 8 generations ago, when 12 generations, when did Locke live? With his essay concerning toleration. So that fact that tolerance is not something, again, I go back to this image of, can you put the other on a shelf somewhere and say they're okay where they are and who they are?
Well put.
That's easier when I don't actually have to deal with the elf on the shelf, right? It's just there. But now it's here. And that other person's deep conviction about the world is rubbing up against my deep conviction about the world. And I think one of the things that I find so valuable about Halik's approach here is that he starts out with talking about the need for our deep humility about how much we know about God and the world. And that while he doesn't want at all to lessen our conviction about our own worldview and the way in which it shapes us and our engagement with the world, he also wants to restrain us from saying, and that's the way it must be for everyone.
Yeah, he does. And right with that, he wants us not only to admit that our way isn't the only way, and that way should be everyone's, but he also, just like you were saying, Peter, wants us to find ways of learning and growing and being stretched by these encounters, without that requiring that we somehow give up or falter in our own trust or conviction. And it seems to have to do again with the way in which truth is not propositional for Halik. It's not a set of doctrines or beliefs that you could write down on a sheet of paper or hundreds of sheets of paper. Because if it were, that whole prospect would be a little bit more threatening, I think. But instead, because it's something we live, and the reality of our living with people who see the world and experience the world different from us is just a given, especially because of that, it's paramount that our own take make room for that, not just to exist, but to somehow impact us and shift us a bit.
Yeah. At one point, in the middle of 113, he asked this question: who do you think you are? Or who do you think you are to arrogate the right to stand so high above all religions that you have a perfect knowledge of them and can fairly assess and compare them and correctly judge their worth? And it reminded me of another Catholic writer, a British priest by the name of Michael Barnes, who similarly says that no one has that point outside the system by which we can map all of the religions on different scales, and just situate them in relationship to each other. He says the theories that try to do that are not about interreligious engagement. They're about interreligious analysis, maybe. But what do we get after the analysis? Rather, he says, we need to shift our attention to the skills, dispositions, and virtues with which people pursue meaning in their lives. And that gets at what you're identifying as the openness to hear from other people, not what they think about Christianity particularly. That might be interesting, I don't know. And not how I can become a Buddhist or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever, but rather to listen to a Muslim talk about the skills, dispositions, and virtues of their own lives in wrestling with these same questions that we wrestle with. That really is engagement with the other that may or may not change how I think about life. It likely will.
Yeah.
It probably won't lead me to become Muslim, but it is that respect and that dignity that Levinas and Derrida and Halik have said is the beginning of our ethics, our relationship with each other. And so he comes to this phrase on 116 about such encounters add to the treasury of mutual respect and trust.
Mm-hmm.
He identifies that as something that we so much need today.
Absolutely. And just to sum up, I've put it this way on the handout, but it's his way of saying that it's not just about ignoring or putting up with others, or to use your language, putting them up on the shelf, as it were, but respecting and loving them with curiosity. And I feel compelled to add that whether because of our own engagement with scripture or our own tradition or whatever, even if something like evangelism just remains a core value for us as people of faith, we'd be really depriving ourselves if we think that that doesn't start with the same kind of mutual respect and trust and learning and humility that Halik is talking about. Even if it might be that some of us or some other people might change their minds or radically alter life because of these conversations, the mistake has been made too many times to assume that that's some kind of one-way conversation or engagement. That's never actually what the transmission of the good news of God looks like in scripture. And even when it tries to look like that in history, again and again, we find that it's not, that it's much more helpfully complicated than that, as the Spirit works in all kinds of unexpected ways.
Yeah, the notion that the only place where one can gain the kind of perspective on reality or relationship with the biosphere that is God is in church, is one that
Yes.
that Halik has already said he finds common cause with certain atheists who are wrestling with these same questions from a completely different foundation. And while he doesn't plan to become an atheist, he's not sure that they have to become Christian either. It's about learning and engaging these skills, dispositions, and virtues, and respecting the fact that they can come from a variety of sources and yet provide us with common ground with those who are not only other, but really different from ourselves.
Yeah. Well, we had a lot to say about chapter 9 here, it seems, which is great. It's actually really helpful to dig into it a bit.
I hope other people think so too.
Yes, I do. But for their sake and ours, maybe we shift to chapter 10. Yep. Like in chapter 9, I imagine a lot of where Halik goes in chapter 10 will be familiar. That when we talk about loving our enemies, we're not talking about having warm fuzzies towards everyone, even if there's some welcome caution about its opposite, that we need not go around angry at everyone, and that'll wreak all kinds of havoc. But instead, there is a need to love even our enemies. And this, while it's not about emotions, it remains as radical a command of Jesus as any. So what do we make of this, Peter? It feels like this has been where the book has been heading in many ways. And now that we're here, how do you see it all clicking?
Well, I think different people are going to see it click differently, in part because I have to say, honestly, I thought I would get more from Halik in this chapter about how it all clicks, about how it all comes together. And perhaps because he's in this section of the book where he's trying to say, I'm not going to have all the answers, but there have been some foundational points along the way that I can use and talk about. But as much as he's using and talking about them, he's offered them to us to use and talk about. So I think a lot of the question here in chapter 10 is, how does all of this about loving the enemy click in terms of what we've been thinking? And I don't expect that you or I are going to have the final answer on that any more than Halik does. I found a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. Honestly, his observation about the be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect from Matthew 5:48 in the Sermon on the Mount. And he's saying that that notion of perfection is not flawlessness, but rather wholeness. And I find that to be a very suggestive and productive way to think about what Jesus means when he says be perfect. I also find his observation that love your enemies, he says, these are my words in some ways, that it's not really a command. I don't know that he says it's not a command, but what he does say is it's like a Jesus koan.
Yes.
And for those who may be familiar with Eastern religions, this will be familiar. A koan is a saying that doesn't have only one meaning, and that you can come back to and come back to and come back to repeatedly and find different aspects and facets of it. And so to take love your enemies not as a demand, but rather as a kind of mantra or a kind of, the sort of thing that you play in your mind as you go through your day-to-day activities to see, oh, what would that mean here? How would that fit here? What different perspective do I get on it in this circumstance? I think that's just brilliant. And it fits with Halik having said, it's not about doctrines, it's not about principle, it's not about formulas, it's about living in truth. And somehow loving your enemies is true. He says that do not kill and love are the two really distinctively Christian notions that he finds in Scripture. So he does want to say this is Christian truth, but it's not a proposition, it's something in which we live. And love your enemies is the koan that is the soundtrack of that living.
Yeah, I too find that really helpful, Peter, and kind of comforting, honestly, and I imagine others might too, because there's a way in which when we hear love your enemies as a command, it just feels impossible. And that relates to this be perfect as flawless. But there's something about hearing love your enemies as this koan to just sort of let rattle around in our minds and in our hearts and recite all the time, that opens up space for it to work on us in ways that we might not even be aware of. And then, of course, in all kinds of ways that we are aware of too, to say, we don't actually know exactly what this means and are just struggling to do it. We can discover all day what it would even mean to do this. And I find that very helpful and much more approachable, actually, into this world of loving our enemies and what it is that Jesus is inviting us into.
Yeah, definitely. Are there other things in this chapter, Hayden, that really resonated for you? Or
yeah, I would point to, on the very last page of the chapter, on 126, this image of God as a father and therefore other people as our siblings is familiar, but as I've seen Halik do at other moments in the book, I can't say I've ever seen anyone use those analogies to make quite this point, which is that it's not a kumbaya moment that we're all brothers and sisters. Halik says, no, think about your own brothers and sisters, your own sibling or sibling-like relationships. It's not all hunky-dory, but what you share is this recognition that we are responsible for each other. We haven't chosen each other, but we are responsible for each other. And as a way of getting at what it means to love anyone who might be in our midst by understanding them as a sibling in the family of God, I think that's really helpful. That it's not about, again, warm fuzzies, but it is about a real connection. When I think of other people as siblings, I often hear that as we have to do something to make that real, to make that reality happen. But I hear Halik flipping that and saying, no, take it as a given that you're already brothers and sisters. Now, how does that change how you act towards one another?
Yeah.
I found that helpful.
Yeah, and I would want to say that in fairness to the ways in which family systems can become deeply dysfunctional and destructive, that there are times when taking responsibility for our siblings is not really a healthy thing. And
Yes.
we need to allow them their own autonomy and their own responsibility for themselves. So it's not that sense of I have to take responsibility for my sibling, but as you say, to be responsible for, with them, to be, and in many ways, it's to be responsive to
Yes.
them. And we get back to that image of you don't just put them on the shelf, right? Mm-hmm. You don't just say, oh, well, you know, that was that, and bam, put them on the shelf, even though disengaging from them may be necessary for my own health, but somehow recognizing that even in that disengagement, I still recognize and honor the connection that I'm now missing. And that has to do with, you know, whether we can grieve well, which often is difficult. But in grieving well, we can't persist in the relationship actively, but we acknowledge that there is a relationship which we are now missing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's,
go ahead.
Oh, what it's reminiscent, Peter, of Halik's points about enmity, that there's a way in which we can disengage without being glad about that disengagement.
Right.
Right. That's faithful.
And that whole notion he offers us that it takes two to be enemies.
Yeah.
It doesn't take two to be angry. It doesn't take two to be, you know, aggressive or to have those feelings. But it does take two to be enemies. And one of the things I heard him say is that the first step in loving your enemy is to decline to be the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And to show a different and better way to engage with that anger or that disappointment or that pain or that frustration or that conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. Well, we've tried to go with Halik in bearing with others and in bearing with enemies.
Yep.
And I have to say, as I got to chapter 11, I had the most trouble figuring out just what is he getting at here. But by the end of the chapter, it became clear to me that what Halik was trying to get us to think about was this idea of bearing all that goes wrong in our lives, that there are big and small disasters all the time, that we have to figure out how to bear.
I wasn't quite sure why he started out with this whole riff on fear. But I think where it comes out is in his observation that so much of fear is fear for ourselves. And that when we fear for ourselves, we draw ourselves in. It's the fight or flight, right? But one of the ways that you flee is to just pull yourself in. And that in the process of either fighting or pulling ourselves in as a reaction of fear, that we do something that attempts to pretend or to change the world in ways we can't, or to pretend that the world isn't what it is.
Yes.
And what Halik seems to want to say is that neither of those is actually spiritually healthy or true. Because the world is what it is. It has evil in it, and it can be tragic, or what he calls bad. And that our fear for ourselves, if it leads us to a fantasy or a denial about the world having evil and tragedy in it, cuts us off from the very world in which God is the biosphere. We need to set that to music, right? And so, rather than saying this rather what I think he calls banal question of why does God let evil happen, he says the far deeper, more meaningful engagement with this world that has evil and tragedy in it is, how does God live in this world as the biosphere of love? And how do we live in that, acknowledging not only the evil and the tragedy, but also God? And so what is it, the first line in the chapter? It's early on. Perfect love casts out fear. It doesn't cast out evil and tragedy. It casts out fear. And it says we can move forward in this world of evil and tragedy, clinging to, trusting, holding on to, living in that love that is God.
Peter, I really like how you've put all of that, and I don't have a lot to add, actually. What it helps me to name and be okay with is there are moments in this chapter where it feels like Halik treats God and God's relationship to evil and disaster in the world too easily or too quickly. Yes. Sort of lets God off the hook.
Absolutely.
But what your reflections help me to recognize is agreeing with Halik on those points is not actually Halik's goal or main concern in this chapter. Rather, he wants us to figure out how to live in the reality in which God is.
Right.
And so that's really where we have to dwell.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. I am not entirely comfortable with the way that he uses human freedom as sort of the adequate response to evil in the world. Not least because I recently was in a Bible study at St. Paul with people who were reading about, biblical Israel and God's commands to biblical Israel to, now that you've beaten that army, slaughter all the soldiers and hopple the horses. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm sorry, my Bible says God commanded that. Not that people
Yeah.
decided, hey, let's do that, but God commanded that. And I don't hear Halik in this chapter dealing adequately with that dimension of our biblical tradition. So I'm, where he goes in his own development of skill, disposition, and virtue to cope with evil and tragedy, I don't think I'm entirely with him in where he goes, but I certainly hear that what he's saying is we each have to go there, and we will find that God is there with us in that wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well said, Peter. And I think there's a lot more actually about all three of these chapters that we could dig into. But unfortunately, I think we have now to wait
Yes,
for the conversation and to join in the joy of being together and continuing to talk about all these things. I hope these chapters were as rich for folks to dig into and react to and respond to and live with as they were for us.
totally agree. I think the way Halik opens up these questions promises that we are going to hear much, much more of great interest about these things than what we've been able to come up with. And I'm very much looking forward to that. So thanks for leading us into it, Hayden. Really helpful to have you find that end of the chapter 11 and get us started there. So many, and also to organize other enemy world so clearly for us. So many, many thanks for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. I'm looking forward to it.